Hello, my name is Xenophon Papadimitris, and I'm a professor of bioinformatics and data science here at Yale. This one more of a supplementary interviews for a new certificate program in medical software and medical AI. Guest today is Stephen Gilbert, who's a professor of medical device regulatory science at the Else Kröner Fresenius Center for Digital Health in Dresden, where he teaches and does research on regulatory science with a team of colleagues. Prior to that, he worked as in senior MedTech digital health roles in industry for about 5 years, and he came back to academia. You'll hear a little bit about his work. His research goes to advance regulatory science, medical device, especially with AI now, and digital approaches. What we're going to talk about today primarily is some of the work around large language models and the issues that present for regulatory science and, medicine and healthcare in general. So, Stephen, thank you for doing this, and tell us a little bit more about how you got here, if I got interested in this topic.
So I started off as a veterinary surgeon, actually. So I'm from a medical subdiscipline in the treatment and diagnosis of animals, but I've done medical treatment, medical surgery, diagnosis, consultation, developing treatment plan for many years in animals, which may sound very, very different to your human medical audience. I assure you it's actually not that different. It's a very similar process. But I very early learned as a veterinary surgeon that I'm actually more suited to a medical career. I initially studied molecular biology, and then I found that bioinformatics and computational biology was more of my home. I worked in kind of PhD and postdocs in computational physiology, simulation approaches in medicine, overlapping, working in labs in mathematical biology. And actually, after a while, I found I wanted to work in industry. And I moved into industry in kind of computational cardiology in the intersection of where that is a medical device and in the clinical evaluation and exploration of evidence for performance in clinical studies for internal defibrillators, for pacemakers. So it's kind of the same areas I've been working in science, but I moved to industry in the clinical evidence area. Mm-hmm. And after a while, I was kind of, in terms of a promotion, I moved for a more senior role in managing a team in the world of digital medical devices and forms of AI. So not large language model forms of AI, but forms of AI in digital medical devices and CE marked in the European context, a CE, regulatory approved digital medical device world. And from there, I saw the potential to actually continue what I was doing as a research professor. So I moved into an academic setting as a research professor exploring medical device regulatory science, which I think is a established discipline in the US. There are many leading centers in the US on medical device regulatory science. In Europe, it's not so established. It's more established in the pharmaceutical sector with the European Medicines Agency in exploring regulatory science, but the medical devices side of regulatory science is not quite so explored, or it has not been so explored up to the moment. And that's the space that I work in. So I work in a digital health institute exploring regulatory science of how should we best regulate, how do we evaluate approaches for regulating digital devices, wearables, apps, AI-based devices, large language models. How does this intersect with data sharing approaches to cybersecurity, approaches to the evaluation of safety, performance, and clinical benefit. And a very major interest, for obvious reasons, since November 2022 has been the question of large language models. I think my own views in this space have evolved somewhat over that year and a half. And I think we're going to explore that in detail in the next question.
Yeah, so you and colleagues wrote this paper. We'll put the link in the chat here about how large language model AI chatbots require approval as medical device. Came out Nature Medicine, June of 2023, which, in this universe is what, 7 months after the start of the field? I mean, people will know that date in the future, I think. I think November 2022 will be one of those dates that we look back on. So give me some give us some background about your perspective on large language models, what you feel they are, and how, and what role you feel they're going to play in medicine. And let's think a little bit about the challenge of regulating them in some ways, or should we be regulating their use? Questions around.
Clearly, I think we should be regulating. If I didn't believe we should be regulating things which are so important, I wouldn't be doing what I do as a professor of medical device regulatory science. But I also wouldn't be doing what I'm doing as a professor in this field if I thought that we could basically take an approach off the shelf and say, well, this is how we regulated hip implants. We have been regulating for hip implants for 40, 50 years, and we can take a approach off the shelf and apply that hip implant approach to large language models. If I believed that was the case, I also wouldn't work in this sector. I would work in a company because there's nothing to say. Everything has already been predetermined. There's no change. The regulations are static, but the regulations remain the same. I clearly, obviously, don't believe that to be the case either. And I think particularly very new technologies challenge the space of regulation to ask the question, is the status quo correct? Or should the status quo, should the current regulation change in some way to acknowledge the technology? And I really think in the question of large language models, this is very much the case that there are areas where the ideas and the frameworks need to change. Now, you mentioned the paper in Nature Medicine that I published with a number of colleagues. Some of them are consultants in the space of digital medical devices, quite a number of medical doctors, senior expert lawyers in the private sphere, former employees and senior managers in the regulators in Europe, and on the intersection of the European Commission approach to regulation of devices. So it was drawing together the opinion of a number of people. We started working on this in about January 2023, which was about, I guess, 2.5 months after the launch of GPT 3.5. And it was published 2 months after the launch of GPT 4 in June 2023. I would stand back. I would stand with most of what we wrote in the paper. I think it's actually stood the test of time relatively well. It has the title. I kind of paraphrase slightly. I may get a word out of place, but large language model applications in medicine are regulated as medical devices. Paraphrasing very slightly there. I don't have it sitting in front of me, but it is pretty much right in terms of the context. That's a title which is actually not technically correct in the sense that the paper discusses in the detail. That actually the table 1 within the paper, the first table you'll come across, discusses the context of what is regulated as a medical device and what's not. We had an initial title for the paper, which was Laws for a Genie and the Regulation of Large Language Models as and use in medicine. And that I prefer that title. I think Nature Medicine thought the title Laws for a Genie doesn't quite fit with their style. But the reason we chose Laws for a Genie is that there are many aspects of large language models which are genie-like. So there's a certain kind of idea that you might rub a lamp in the Arabian Nights. We discussed that I collect old books, and as I talk to you, I've got a picture of Yale's library of ancient and antiquarian books in the background. So I'm kind of interested in old books. And in the 1001 Nights, you have this kind of concept of the genie is a mystical force. It has power, but it also has power that can be challenging to control. When the genie comes out of the lamp, sometimes you wish the genie did not come out of the lamp. Mm-hmm. You have a concept for a lot of sayings about the genie, like putting the genie back in the bottle. Clearly, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. Genies, when they are released, there's often an unpredictable effect of the things you wish for. There's things that you have to be very careful what you ask a genie, because you might get something from the genie which is quite different than what you expected to get. within like the Disney version, which is I give quite a lot of presentations in this space, and I use the images of the genie and images of the Aladdin film from Disney. And Disney introduced this concept for the genie, where the genie can grant a certain limited number of wishes, and also where there's certain laws for a genie, where a genie cannot kill people. And I think that's a critical law for a genie. We're going to regulate this space. We want to have laws in place that genies cannot kill people, which was as far as I understand, was not a part of the original 1001 Nights, but it is an addition, a very good addition. And part of the paper is about how we have the genie. We acknowledge we cannot put the genie back in the bottle, but we have some regulations which dictate how we would try and ensure safety for this very, very new and very different area.
Yeah, so if you look at the history of this thing, right, we start with hardware devices. We adapt them for software at some point, and people argue whether that adaptation was done well or not, but there's some emerging regulation that's sort of more software specific. And now we move from software to this, I don't know what the correct word, like more unpredictable version of software, perhaps, or more powerful vector software, or less controllable version of software. There's all these words that I would write. Perhaps if you think about a specific piece of software, it can do certain things and it can do other things, and you kind of know what it can and can't do. We have a very generalist system here that theoretically could do many, many things, which is obviously a challenge in terms of all kinds of issues with medical devices. How do we validate it? How do we ensure that? How do you do risk management on something that you don't know exactly what the range of outputs is? So if you can talk us through a little bit of some of the concepts in the paper, of what, and maybe your evolving thoughts as to where you feel this thing should go. Where should we be thinking about regulating these things? If you were in charge of creating the regulation for large language models based on what you know now, obviously this is a slow process and it's emerging as we speak. Where do you think we should be heading to? What is your sense of?
So I think I would divide your question in two parts. So the first part is about how one would apply the frameworks, and the paper is the Nature Medicine paper in June is mostly about how one applies the current frameworks to the tools, and how one, if one was trying to get an approved large language model according to the medical device regulations or according to the FDA regulations in this space, which are not massively different in this respect, how would one go about it? And there's actually a table 3 in the paper which sets out exactly the process one should follow if one's trying to do this. And then the second part of your question I'll come back to, which is what if we were to change the frameworks? And the paper in its last paragraphs touches on that a little bit, and some of my subsequent work addresses this question, which is a very different question in many ways. If we get to the first part of the paper, which is that the medical device frameworks as they currently exist apply to this space, you've touched on some of the problems already in your introduction. Like we clearly have the hallucinating property of the genie. It's well documented that we can get hallucinations and that they can be quite hard to control. There's you've touched on it already, and we discuss it in the paper, the challenge of risk assessment. The challenge of risk assessment of something which is indeterminate in its answers. It's challenging to risk assess anything, but it's very challenging to risk assess something where you can ask the same question in exactly the same way and get different answers, depending on exactly when you asked it and depending on who asked it, and certainly depending on very subtle variations of how you asked it. This creates a very large problem in terms of how you address risk assessment. Now, there are approaches that one could use, and we discuss these in the paper. So one of them, we have this terminology in the European context of SOUP, software of unknown provenance. And if you want to use GPT-4 large API, you have a very large problem of software of unknown provenance. It's unknown in a number of ways. One is it's very hard to define actually what went into it. It's very hard to define how it would be updated. It's very hard to define how it is updated in real time based upon changes to constraints made by the developer of that system. And even in terms of reinforcement learning, which goes from the feedback approaches, which are used in thumbs up and thumbs down in simple terms, in terms of adapting in time. So as a manufacturer of a medical device, you're kind of not in control of what's probably or almost certainly a very major factor in producing the final outputs from your device based on inputs. You got inputs that you could collect. You could do some control of those inputs. You give them to a cloud-based API, and it changes completely in its properties, and it gives you back outputs. So this is kind of makes it a very, very challenging situation to use this in a medical device context. And one of the approaches that we discuss in the paper where you could have more control is instead of using an API is to develop, which could be very challenging, or to use your own open source version of a large language model. And in the subsequent period, there've been a very large number of those that have come along where you can actually, you can have a framework which is developed, but you can run as your own large language model where you can actually ensure that there are no changes. So at least on that one aspect, change, you could be in a situation of change. And I think most companies which are taking an approach of going for a medical device approved large language model would be taking that approach at least to some degree. There are of course companies and approaches which are taking many model approaches where you may have some aspects which are on of certain lower risk use cases which are using an API to something like GPT-4, but for very safety critical use cases are using a internally controlled large language model, let's say. And then in the paper, we also discuss whether that large language model would be a medical large language model as opposed to kind of a general large language model trained on the open internet. We make this suggestion, which I think is somewhat controversial, that medical large language models would be superior. I think there's some challenge of that in the literature. I think that you kind of end up with very apples to oranges comparisons in this space, very highly developed non-medical specialist large language models compared to very nascent, only early in development medical large language models. So it's very, very hard to compare this world. I think another aspect, there's one aspect in the paper that we hint at, but don't address very specifically because it was in June of 2023. It was not a highly developed area, but I've put quite a lot to say on the theme now, is retrieval augmented generation. So it's not a term we use specifically within the paper, but we hint at approaches which could be used to verify information based upon external sources, which I think captures quite a lot of what retrieval augmented generation is, and we mentioned that as an approach. And another thing that we mention as an approach, if you are going to try and develop a large language-based medical device within a software as a medical device framework, which is your only option in a European setting, is to consider very carefully your intended purpose and your interface to that device and your approach to prompt engineering such that you're narrowing scope. So clearly a problem is if your device is answering anything based on any input for any purpose. This is going to be very, very challenging for you to get approval as a medical device in a European framework. And our suggestion is to very carefully narrow scope so that you can test within that scope. Even with all of those things, and I think there are a few others we discussed in the paper, you still face very large hurdles. And we introduce it in that level in the paper. If you want to try it, follow this framework, but it's not going to be easy. I think speaking to consultants in this space, you'll get some consultants who'll say, it's no problem, particularly if you took on that this acknowledgement that you wouldn't use an open API and you would take control of the provenance of the large language model. But you'll get certain consultants that will say, that's no problem, easy, come and speak to me. To some extent, that's the job of the consultant. And it's not a very good business strategy to say, that's going to be really tough. I don't know about that. Almost certainly not. It's not a good, winning. You're not going to get the clients. It's going to be the person who says, yeah, no problem, it's easy. We haven't yet seen the approved devices in Europe in order to make the comparison. And as you're probably aware in Europe as well, because we've got a rather fragmented system, it could be that some devices get approved from some notified bodies when we could have the same situation with another notified body, perhaps in another country, with effectively the same submission, but we wouldn't even know that it was the same submission, gets a very different answer. But I think this over time will become a bit clearer. That was addressing the first part of your question.
Let me just clarify one thing for people listening. So since ChatGPT and the like came out, there are a number of open source models that people have downloaded and customized, and you can tune and control. Many of them originate from Facebook. Llama is probably the most known one. So there are options for having complete control over these things. Actually, just listening to you speak, I'm involved with some effort to do some technical information reports for Amy in the US about cloud services in medical devices. And it's like everything we worry about is like a small fraction of what will happen when you have a large language model as a cloud service, right? Where not only you don't control the software, but you don't even know what the software changes dramatically from time to time. So it was interesting to hear. Let's move to the next part now, and let's think about, okay, this is the situation as is. As far as I know, and let's just be clear, you don't think there's anything like that has made it through in the EU, and I don't think there's anything that's made it through in the US in the medical device space with a large language model. I could be wrong, but I haven't heard of anything.
So yeah, it's a good question. Just on your previous point, so I think on terms of large language models, one could attempt to use and would be interesting to explore. I definitely think the Llama 2 approaches and as far as I'm aware, they even have a commercially accessible license where you could even commercially use with very acceptable licensing term within your company approaches. Based on Llama 2, where you could take control, and it probably is applicable. And I think Mistral are interesting to explore in this space as well. Certainly with open source models, I'm not quite sure in the commercial aspects of the use in that context, but there's a very interesting space. The second part of your question is, are there any approved large language-based medical device products? And I'm not aware of any, but something that I always do at the start of my presentations on this theme when I'm in a live audience now, which it's not quite the same when we're doing this as a one-to-one webinar, is I kind of ask the audience, first of all, I state that it's a very carefully worded question within it and listen to the wording. And I ask the audience, I'm going to ask you a following question. Please raise your hand if you think yes, and keep your hand down if you think no. And I asked them, are there any currently on market clinical decision support systems in the US in medicine? And very frequently, very few people raise their hands. And then I asked them the same questions. Are there any on market in medicine clinical decision support systems in Europe? And very few of them raised their hands. And then I give the answer in my view of the answer. And I think we've interacted a little bit in this theme. So if I had asked you the first question, you probably would have raised your hand to say, yes, there are on-market systems. It's a very specific wording. There are on-market systems in the US. It's questionable. You could ask the question whether they're legally on-market, but on-market means on-market. Legally on-market means legally on-market. There are on-market systems with a specific, very direct promotional claim on their high level, on their provision of their service, in their tools, and in their terms of service of being clinical decision support systems for doctors. So for doctors in the US, which in my Nature Medicine paper, I interpret their use case as not falling within the terms or the clauses of the FDA's clinical decision support guidance. So I would, if I was in the FDA and interpreting my own guidance in the FDA, my view and the view of my co-authors to that paper in early 2023 would be that those tools are not according to that guidance. The reason being, and we specify this within the paper, so you can go back and read it, is because we don't view that the basis for the provided advice would be acceptable to say the basis effectively it's from Reddit. It's from a large language model. We trained it on the internet. That's not really a basis. And even with aspects of retrieval augmented generation in those tools, which are there, I don't think that's an adequate basis to say that those tools are non-devices. So these tools are on the market as non-devices under the CDS guidance. That's a critical point to make. They haven't gone through the FDA process where you have to do a submission or an authorization where you would actually have to have an assessment. They're on the market on the basis of saying we're non-device on the US. And the other aspect where I don't think that there is adequate argument that the non-device is on the aspect of clinical evidence. You have to provide clinical evidence. And my reading of the FDA guidance is that has to be specific. It's not okay to say somebody did a study where they asked a series of medical choice, multiple choice questions that were used in some doctor evaluation for a completely different purpose, and ChatGPT did okay, therefore that's evidence. I would interpret that as a specific evidence to the answer given, not a general evidence, and I don't think even that general evidence is adequate. So my view for those tools, which are relatively easy to find, or if anybody, I'll avoid mentioning the names of manufacturers at this stage, but I think there'll be many more manufacturers in the future. My interpretation would be that those are possibly not legally in the market, or possibly not in line with the FDA guidance. But that's only my opinion. I'm actually not a US citizen, nor am I an employee of the FDA. And it's a very interesting space, as you know, because even if that's the opinion of the FDA, it's up to the FDA how they act on that. So the manufacturers currently on the market are currently being used, the decision support systems, by doctors to get advice for decision support in the treatment of patients, in the diagnosis of patients, and in the formation of treatment plans for patients. That's all fact. I could pull one and show you one of these tools live now on the screen share, but we won't do that in the nature of time. The next steps are really, really interesting. So how will it develop from here? It's one of the most fascinating times in terms of how things are developing in front of us. It can kind of go in a number of forking steps. It can go that the FDA make an internal decision. Actually, well, it's pretty much we don't agree with Gilbert et al. In Nature Medicine. We view that actually this is okay. This falls within the context of being a non-device, in which case there's no action for the FDA to take. They actually consider that such tools are providing adequate basis and adequate clinical decision. They're providing adequate means to prevent automation bias. They're providing adequate means to be non-emergency use and adequate means to provide a general list of outputs rather than specific outputs, in which case they have no action to take other than to kind of observe these tools. If they decide, like my view really is that it doesn't fall within the guidance, they have to decide whether they write a letter to the manufacturer saying your tool is illegally on the market. And once they make that decision, then you have the next forking branch of how the future rolls out before us. The next forking branch is how the manufacturer reacts to the FDA letter. So the manufacturer can say, okay, FDA, we accept your point. We'll roll back to what we were doing before, which was to label our tool as a medical brain exercise tool. That's the previous label. That at the time that I wrote my paper, these tools existed, but they had the label try out your medical thinking, test your differential diagnosis skills, but labeled not for use in the clinical decision support of patient for diagnosis or treatment planning of patients. So the companies can roll back, or the companies can decide to challenge the FDA. To wait till the FDA challenges them in the courts, or to challenge the FDA directly in the courts, either approach. And the British, sorry, I'm correct the word British, it's actually British plus European context. I think about both, but it's actually the European context. If I'd asked you the same question, are there on-market clinical decision support systems using large language models in Europe at the moment or in the UK at the moment? Would the answer be yes or no? It's an unfair question.
I would have guessed no, but you never know.
So the answer to this one is also yes. And I would caveat it by illegal in my opinion, and I'm not a judge. And there are, if you go to the Google App Store, you can download AI Doctor based on GPT-4. And this is very interesting. So as far as I'm aware, this one is available on the US as well. So it applies to the US as well. You can download it in any country in Europe. And it's a very cartoon interface, gamified interface. And it's really interesting because this one is for patients. So this is a step further. This is where the tool is for providing medical doctor answers to the patient based on GPT-4, clearly labeled AI doctor based on GPT-4. And if you go to the interface, you can ask a generalist, GP, But you can also ask a cardiologist or internal medic. They all have different cartoon pictures, and then you can go in, you can ask your question. It says, I'm a internal medic. I can answer questions about complex diseases, including metabolic diseases, and and you can type in your question, etc. So I would interpret that as illegal on market, but it's on market.
Let's sort of close the parenthesis here and sort of finish off by saying, okay, so this is what's going on now. There are products on the market that are labeled, that's a technical term, but they're sort of marketed as critical decision support systems and, in your opinion, should be devices, or they're not even that. They're just as patient-facing tools that maybe should be regulated differently. But as we think about this space and we think about large language models and how far we've come in a year and a bit and where we may be, so what would be your approach? Like, what would you like to see? Like, if you had to make your recommendations as to how should we regulate them, right? They're not hip implants. They're not traditional software. They have their own risks. They have their own problems. Where do we go from here?
So I think it's a really interesting question. An area that we do address a lot in the Nature of Medicine paper is the question of whether ChatGPT or BARD itself is a medical device. And this has been a subject to questions that have been put to regulatory authorities, and regulatory authorities have actually provided answers in Europe. And the answer has been quite clear from regulatory authorities that ChatGPT is not a medical device, that BARD is not a medical device, for the very clear reason of intended purpose. These tools have not been put on the market for the intended purpose of providing an answer, but they do create a very interesting paradox that sometimes their medical answers are actually not bad, and we can anticipate that they will be used a lot by both doctors and by lay people and by patients to answer medical questions. Now, the paper in Nature Medicine, we discussed quite a lot that that's been the case since the dawn of time. And by the dawn of time, I kind of mean 1995 and the evolution of the Google search engine, or 1996 and so on, not quite the dawn of time, but it's been so much, part of our thinking that, as a veterinary surgeon, when I used to work in practice, I used to Google stuff all the time and, and use it as a quick index researching stuff. It wasn't that I didn't know anything, but it would give me certain quick access to certain amounts of information that I would be filtering through using my medical knowledge. And doctors use Google all the time. And at the time of Google search engine coming out, there were certain medical authorities saying, this should be never used by doctors and there needs to be controls in place. And it never happened. And I think there are good reasons why it would not have been pragmatic to do so. I do think that there is a need to look at the context of what would happen with our current approach to the regulation of these tools. And there's an idea that I would bring in that's based on some of my current work. And it's kind of, some of it can sound a little bit like common sense, but I think it's worth saying, even though some of it may come across as common sense. And that is actually to ask the question, it's slightly a reaction to the work of Moore et al., published in Nature, in the paper. Eric Topol's a co-author on it. There's been a major impact in terms of this paper, generalist medical artificial intelligence, towards general medical artificial intelligence. And I think it's a really interesting paper, and it introduces a lot of conversation about the potential for these tools, including multimodal approaches. And there's also a very interesting recent paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine AI journal by Tu et al. from Google. And again, it's exploring the potential for multimodal approaches to interrogation of electronic health records, including images, and getting decision support on those in a medical context. And some of my recent work actually addresses, from a regulatory context, whether these generalist approaches are devices at all. And that's kind of a very simple question in some ways, and to a member of the public or somebody working in the non-software as a medical device community kind of seems quite obvious. It's almost a surprise to people. You say to them, did you realize that AI is regulated as a medical device? So, no, I didn't realize, because they think of a hip implant as a medical device. What is a medical device? It's a hip implant. Did you know AI is also a medical device? They'd probably be surprised. And even people in the medical community are quite surprised. And sometimes there's this kind of very ill-tempered or also quite dismissive argument where people remind people that these things are regulated as medical devices, and they're kind of surprised that people in the community don't realize. But part of my recent work is to actually go straight to the reason why there's this kind of ill-tempered or slightly trivial argument. There's a reason why the argument is a little bit trivial. And to actually ask the question, are we talking about a device at all? So if we talk about a generalist, let's assume for the moment that it's possible to have a generalist intelligence, a generalist approach to medical artificial intelligence. And we're not necessarily going in the deep philosophical theory of what's general AI. You know, is it truly intelligent? Is it truly aware? I'm trying to leave out all of this discussion. I'm trying to ask the question, can it answer generalist questions in a way that provides useful input to a clinician in the workup of a case, or even to a patient in the workup of a case? That's the test. Can it answer generalist questions well, or maybe even better than a doctor? When we get to that question, can it answer generalist questions well? Is that a device? So if it's actually a generalist intelligence, is that actually a device? And what I mean by that, if we look at how these tools work, they are actually not developed at all as a device.
Mm-hmm.
They are developed as an intelligence. And they have, you know as well as me or better than me, this well-defined zero-shot property in that they answer questions which they were not trained to answer. So it's part of this thing that we discussed in the Nature of Medicine paper. They provide plausible answers to any scenario. And they're only stopped from providing plausible answers when they've been constrained to do so artificially in their build process, and actually after training the models, and they've been constrained as an extra layer on top of that. So what we're dealing with is things which are not devices, either in the common Oxford English Dictionary definition of a device, which is a tool developed by humans to perform a specific task. They're not that. They're actually an intelligence in that they can perform any task. They give an intelligent answer. And really part of the crux of why there's so much, we mentioned just before this call, but so much interest in this space is exactly on that fact, because they give an answer as an intelligence and not as a device. And they have this zero-shot property. You can ask a completely new question. It'll be the first time you ask the multimodal approaches, which include vision, interpret this X-ray along with interpreting these clinical notes, alongside this image of the lines on the toenail. Mm-hmm. And you get an answer which doesn't depend on it being in its training, given sets of toenail images, sets of histopathology images, plus sets of clinical notes. Now, it's not to say that it's right in all cases, and that's not the argument I'm trying to make at the moment. The argument is that it's performing the task of an intelligence. And if a reaction one often reads in the kind of software as a medical device community is to all of the research in this space, which is quite interesting research that's coming out showing potential, is to say, well, I'd like to see you getting that through the medical device software as a medical device framework. You're going to have fun with that. But sometimes it might be the wrong question, because in a lot of my presentations on this at the moment, I use the image of Gandalf. And Gandalf's in front of the demon. He's kind of on a bridge and he's stamping down his staff and he's saying, "You shall not pass." It seems to be slightly more of a "you shall not pass" answer based upon a set of rules which existed for a set of technologies, which were not the technology we're talking about. They were designed for devices, and they have a requirement for deep learning and machine learning, but a deep learning, Epoch 2 AI. We use the kind of classification from recent paper from JAMA by Howell. I quite like the classification of AI into epochs. They effectively have an answer which is applicable to earlier epochs of AI, and which is applicable to standard hardware or implant devices, which is they must be designed for their task. It's a fundamental prior requirement that you start off from defining your intended purpose. You look at user needs. You bring everything through a process of a design matrix, design input, mm-hmm. Design matrix, design output, specification, and then this process of build in that manner, including deep learning devices, and it works okay for deep learning devices. It's not actually a problem. You need to think about it a slightly different way when you're using an algorithm to generate a prediction model based upon labeled X-ray images, but it effectively works because you're still doing that design process, but you've got the learning as part of the design process. Human is determining what it's supposed to do, and human is just kind of defining definition of good, and you have the learning process in the middle. It doesn't matter that you're using a convolution neural network in the middle to do that. It doesn't really change anything because it's designed for purpose. You then are taking that framework and saying, well, I'd like to see you apply that to large language models. Well, of course you can't, because the large language model is acting as an intelligence. That's why people are talking about it so much, is because it's acting as an intelligence. And I've had debates with regulators, and I've discussed the same concept with them. And I've sometimes have people saying, well, this is nothing new. It all existed before. It's just deep learning. It's just the same as convolutional neural networks. It's not. There's a fundamentally different thing, which comes out of the ability to answer a question without being trained on a question. It's using neural networks, of course, it's using some of the same methodologies, but it can answer questions it was never trained to answer. And that is a task that human doctors do. It's a task that the framework, if we apply it, then you can absolutely say that you cannot have generalist intelligence according to those frameworks. Because because the frameworks say that you must design for your intended purpose, right? And that would be okay. So it's okay to have the Gandalf staff saying, you shall not pass, if that's a decision from, in a democratic society, in the end, the people, or the people that represent the people. So if that's a decision. But it shouldn't be on the basis that we had never thought it might happen, and we created a framework for hip implants, and the framework for hip implants says that can't happen, therefore it can't happen. That's not really an argument. It should be because we've looked at it and we consider it's unsafe, that's okay. Or we looked at it and we consider it's a good idea with caveats, or even we looked at it and we think everything goes. I'm personally very much not in the everything goes, and I'm not in the nothing goes. I'm in the mode that we need to develop frameworks that acknowledge what it is. And it's not to say there won't be any constraints, but I think if you're in a situation, let's say that Europe or took an approach that you cannot use an intelligence approach, as in not trained for a specific intended purpose. And for the sake of argument, China took the approach, which is that we'll develop new frameworks acknowledging we have aspects of intelligence in the sense that it can do things it wasn't trained to do at all, can answer any question. You have a very interesting conundrum, and I published another paper with some of the same authors as the paper in Nature Medicine, exploring feedback loops that exist in the regulatory frameworks at all. And it'd be great if we shared it actually in the links.
We'll add it.
Yeah. And it's a paper. It's actually published in JAMA, and it's called "Learning from Experience in the Regulation of AI-based Medical Devices." And it's got this feedback loop, which is illustrated through a weighing scale. And the weighing scale, instead of just having standard pans, it's got fluid collection reservoirs. So they're a little bit like, pans you could put coins on or weights, but it has fluid reservoirs. And the fluid reservoirs represent overregulation and underregulation. And as the fluid reservoirs go up and down, well, when they go down, they actuate a pump, which fills up the reservoir on the other side. So it's typical, as an engineer, illustration of a feedback mechanism. And the argument on the diagram is that you have societal level, high level feedback mechanisms on how regulation functions. I can provide a very simple illustration of that within the context of the medical device regulation within Europe. You start off with a context where there is a concern over under-regulation, concern over reckless innovation, an argument that you need to have tough new laws, And the effect of the argument is that you have tough new laws is you have an overreach, if over-regulation, or sometimes bad regulation, or sometimes inefficient introduction of the new laws. You have insufficient capacity over tight laws nobody can meet. You then, what's your effect? Your effect is that you have less state-of-the-art devices on the market. So comparative to the international situation, you look very antiquated, or even the things you used to have on market go off the market because it no longer is economical or possible to get them there. And that causes the one side, the other side of the weighted balance to go down, and feeds back through the society loop of cut red tape. We need to cut red tape. We need to get rid of regulation because it's stopping us having enough devices or a state of the art. And this is all mediated through newspaper articles. And at the time of before the introduction of MDR, you've got the newspaper article saying our regulation is unsafe, medical device regulation is unsuitable, irresponsible companies. And then with the overreaction, which is part of the MDR, or not, overreaction is maybe the wrong word. It's sometimes over, it's sometimes not well enough thought out, not well enough implemented, not well enough resourced, but it's a group it with over. You then get the newspaper articles, and there've been waves and waves of them in Europe, TV reports. I'm sometimes asked to speak on them and to contribute to them, which is the regulation is a disaster. We need to cut the regulation because it's stopping the safety of patients. So it's in this feedback loop. What we need in the regulation of large language models is to get away from that situation of the feedback loops, but the feedback loops also operate internationally. So if we go back to what would happen in Europe, if Europe takes an extremely conservative approach, but China doesn't, well, you can kind of make an argument China's a very different society. And some of the argument for the AI Act has been that not everything done in AI in China might be acceptable. If we shift the argument slightly and say that the US takes a very different context, which is likely to do so, that then becomes a very difficult argument from a European perspective. What you tend to get is the comparison. People travel much more to the US, they interact with the US, they interact with US media. It becomes a very strange world where the US is evolving to a situation where you can have intelligence assisting patients, assisting doctors, interpreting individual clinical notes, interpreting images and clinical records together in the US, but it's a completely walled off technology. It's like, that's okay for the US, but it's completely, we don't accept that in Europe because this intelligence application to medicine is completely not allowed in our frameworks. Or we'd say our regulation says that this thing is not allowed because you have to design it first. Why? Because we developed that 40 years ago and we think it's okay. But in the US, you start to see this happening. So people, go and live in the US, their son is at university in the US, they start to experience that world. That actuates this cut the red tape argument. And it doesn't only actuate it through the insufficient supply to state of the art, to what might be seen as the modern world, or more efficient delivery of healthcare, or life-saving new technologies. There's another side of the actuator, which is actually, do we have any jobs? Are we competing in Europe in the level where we can actually develop technologies? If we have a company like Mistral in Paris, but if we have a situation where we have companies even starting in Europe, do they have to move to the US to really have any traction to actually, are we developing I always give the analogy of Brave New World. So in Brave New World, I'm not sure if you've read it, but the Aldous Huxley book where you kind of get the world divided into different groups. And there's kind of a world of the savages, which is not the savages are particularly bad, but they live outside. There's aspects of the Brave New World, which is also very bad. I acknowledge that when I give the example of Brave New World, but in the world of the savages, it's kind of a region where the technology changes and advantages are not introduced. And as much as I wouldn't want the Brave New World vision, that's as disturbing as the savage vision, ideally, the argument from the balance is actually that you have regulatory science, you have thought about what you're introducing as frameworks. You don't purely listen to the industry lobby, which of course has a specific line. But also, you don't say, well, we always did it this way before. Our framework says that you must have design controls which show that this particular change to your hip implant needs to be made in this particular manner, how you bring that through your verification process, your validation process. risk assessment process for each change, which will probably come slightly before that. You bring it through your clinical evaluation process, you produce new evidence, you submit your approval documentation, etc. Well, if you're going to do that before you ask your zero-shot model to give its answer, that basically the technology doesn't exist. And there's, like, I could kind of roll on from that. Maybe I will roll on from it if you would interrupt me, about two other aspects of what you discussed in this current work on this, in terms of it's in progress or not, it's current work, in terms of what the implications are also looked at from a slightly different perspective. And that's on the role of the physician. So I kind of said before, I'm kind of physician, and from being trained as a veterinary surgeon, and I've done the consultation process. But we have a very interesting paradox coming along about the role of the physician, which can happen if we don't acknowledge that that there can be regulatory approved generalist approaches. And that is that it's actually impossible to wall off these technologies. So let's imagine where you try and wall them off. In the rest of the world, let's say in China and in Korea and Japan, they have these approaches, and maybe even the US, they have these approaches. And in Europe, the approach, the line is generalists cannot exist because generalists cannot be taken through design controls in a traditional manner as initially designed for implants. You have a very interesting situation that the patient can use generalist. So like Stanford University developed a very interesting tool, which they didn't make openly available. You can get it in GitHub. And it's actually many months ago, so it sounds ancient now. We're talking about 6-9 months ago. I think they launched this. One of my students saw it at a conference, and then they shared the information with me, and I looked into it. But it was on GitHub. Maybe it's even available as a tool now directly, but at that time it was available on GitHub. And you could basically, it would take your Apple Health Kit individual patient data and port it and give you, a decision support from GPT-4 based on Apple Health Kit. Those technologies are going to continue to develop, and they're not just going to be based on GPT-4. They're going to be based on Llama 2 model from Google. They're going to be based on Gemini. They're going to be based on Amy. They're going to be based on the latest generations. And increasingly, the patient's going to have access not only to their personal and wellness health data through things like Apple Health Kit, and it's going to be, over time, increasingly sophisticated. They're also going to have access to their electronic health record from programs across the world for increased access to electronic health record. So you've got both records. You've got your wellness record, you've got your health record, and nobody can stop you using a model from any other country. Just use a VPN, and you can access the best generalist medical intelligence in the world. So before you go to your consultation, and immediately after you go to consultation, or even in real time, you can be speaking into your phone, and it's taking your latest data and listening to what your doctor is saying, and it can be giving you the generalist medical artificial intelligence view on your medical condition. Now, the doctor who's following the law in Europe, where there's going to be no allowance of this technology, is, well, the doctor that breaks the law, that turns around and types it into his laptop, which is, they tried in Australia. I discussed this in the paper, in the Nature of Medicine paper. They said in Australia, the hospital groups and the AMA, the Australian Medical Association, not the American, but the Australian Medical Association, said you must not do this. But the doctor who doesn't obey the rules and turns around and types it into his laptop, or is a legal running version of one of these tools in his laptop, he's in the loop in terms of having input from decision-making approaches, which in the end can consider multiple data points, which humans in the end are limited in. That's why we're starting to see some better answers coming from these approaches. So the law-breaking doctor and the patient are in the loop of this information. The law-following doctor, well, he's kind of now confronted by a situation where the queued in patient, or even just the patient over time, which is just made easy for them to access, has access to much more refined information than he has or she has in order to make decisions. The legal doctor, the doctor who's breaking the law, has also access to that information, so that the law-following doctor group is going to remain quite small. But what's the role of the law-following doctor? What's their purpose? How do they make a decision? How do they compete with what the patient knows? When the patient knows more, they're in a rather interesting paradox. And there's another aspect of this which I'll jump onto again, but then I'll pause because I probably should drink some water. The other situation, well, when we considered this within the journal we submitted it to, and in the end, in the peer review process, I took this particular comment out because it wasn't liked by the peer review process, but I would still put it in as a very valuable comment, maybe a little bit too controversial. And some of the peer reviewers didn't think it was valid, but I do think it's valid. If you throw into this mix the litigation lawyer. So the litigation lawyer has access to the patient record. He can create a website, or the agency before the litigation lawyer, he can create a website saying, upload your medical record, including your differential diagnosis and your treatment from your doctor, and we'll give you a first surveillance view using our AI technologies of whether you've suffered medical negligence. Now, again, you're in a situation where what's the precise role of the doctor who's had to make decisions on the treatment plans and the therapy of the patient, the differential diagnosis of the patient in the dark, to decision support tools, which the patient has access to, the illegal doctor has access to, doctors in other countries would have access to, and the litigation lawyer has access to. And it creates a very interesting conundrum. The conundrums with the use of these technology, and we discussed this within this paper, which is under review, are very interesting as well, because there is a huge challenge about explainability. We could talk about the explainability paradox of how one introduces decision support systems in general into medical practice, where you can try and have explainability, but sometimes explainability can make the doctor worse. And we discussed that at length. And in the end, my approach and answer to this is, in the end, one needs to get the explainability to work better. One needs to train doctors to work with explainability. One needs to develop tools which include explainability in a way that helps. And unfortunately, and one of the very negative effects for human decision-making is at the moment that the evidence is more in the direction that explainability makes things worse. And I don't see that as a fundamental. I see that as bad explainability is my hypothesis. Bad explainability makes it worse, whereas good explainability and adaptive explainability, where the doctors are also adapting to a new explainability world, can make better decisions.
Right. No, it's all a brave new world, literally, not just the book, but we are in a space where the rules are changing as we speak. What's available is changing. I mean, in the US, you also have the situation where health insurance companies will be able to do this and, question whether the treatment that your doctor is asking for is appropriate for your, when they're trying to cut costs, they can use those tools. And when the lawyers use it, when the insurance companies use it, those are not medical users. Technically, they're not doing diagnosis, so they might be under looser constraints potentially right there, because they're not doing diagnosis or treatment. They're not devices at that point because it's not in the health space. So
like this legal point.
This is technically the case in the US, whether it's true or not.
Okay, that's the point I was going to raise. I have debated this with people, and I have different perspectives on the insurance and this use case of whether it would be a medical device. But I accept this point. I'm not sure either in Europe or in the US. And I think the insurance question is a very, very interesting one.
Yeah.
And it opens a whole other kind of can of worms. I attended last week meetings in Brussels about the application of AI technologies in social security assessment, so working capacity assessment. Like, that's also a very interesting area where it's not only medicine in terms of can I make you better, but it's medicine in terms of are you entitled to benefits for not being capable. And we face, in my view, there is an absolute need for human in the loop decision making in almost all of these areas. But I don't think the answer to human in the loop decision making is to say we can ignore these technologies. I think we need to acknowledge the importance of these technologies and get them to work with human in the loop.
Yeah, no, it's how we develop human in the loop appropriately is probably the challenges, right? How, not simply human plus computer, but how does the human actually communicate? How does the explainability work out? How do we do all those things? I think is the big challenge facing us. Steven, I think we went for a while. I don't want to keep you any longer. We're going to put some links to the documents that you mentioned, the papers, and there'll be good situations for the students to go through. And thank you for taking the time.
Okay, it's been great. Thank you very much for your time.